Welcome back to our collection. The first segment was World War I and World War II. And World War I and World War II had a definite beginning and a definite end. But this collection, well, it didn't have a definite beginning. It's called the Cold War collection. And it had a sort of a definite end. It's over a couple of years. And the section I'm going to begin with is the bombers and the role the bombers played in the Cold War. Our key bomber during that period, and the period was from 1949 to 1989, so it was a 40-year period. And the key bomber during that period was a hybrid. It was partly jet and it was partly propeller. So it had 6 propellers on the back and 4 jets under the wing. It was called a Peacemaker. It never dropped a bomb in the Cold War, but it was designed to drop hydrogen bomb or nuclear bomb. And it was a real imposing aircraft. It was very large and very threatening looking, but it never was used in combat. The plane that was used in combat, and this is the most significant airplane ever designed, it's the B-52 Stratocruiser, B-52 bomber. And it was designed at the end of World War II, actually in the beginning of 1952 when it was first produced. And it was designed before we had computers. It was designed with 8 jet engines. And it was designed to be a sort of a stopgap until we had a faster plane called the B-58 Hustler, which came out in 1958. But the Hustler never replaced it. The Hustler went into the junkyard. And then they brought out the B-1 in 1970s to replace this. And the B-1 is now being phased out. It's going to the junkyard. The B-2 is a bomber, but it carries a small payload. And now we're working on a B-21, which will be designed to replace this. But what makes this plane so remarkable, it's going to be in service in the Air Force for 110 years. It's scheduled to be dephased in 2062. 2062. And it was first incorporated in 1952, so there's never been a military aircraft or a piece of military equipment like that that's been frontline for 110 years. And there's been a lot of technology advancements. These advancements have been incorporated in this plane, but it was used extensively in Vietnam, and it was used in almost every campaign, Iraq and Iran and everything. It's the backbone of our Air Force bombing command right now. And it's shows you if something's designed perfectly, it has the ability to incorporate new technology, that's the plane for it. This plane didn't. It was kind of a hybrid. It wasn't really good as a propeller plane. It wasn't really good as a jet plane. So this is a much more advanced and a better aircraft. Let me go back to the Cold War because it's quite an interesting story. And you know, it really ties in perfectly with what's happening in Ukraine today. There wasn't a beginning in the Cold War, but probably in 1948, President Harry Truman was President of the United States. He was from the state of Missouri. He invited his best friend, who was out of office at the time, Winston Churchill, to come to the state of Missouri in the center of the United States to a small college called Westminster College in a small town of about 10,000 called Fulton, Missouri, to give a talk. And he got up and he began to talk about a subject called the Iron Curtain. And it's one of the most famous speeches ever made by any politician. He said from Trieste in Yugoslavia to the Balkans, there's been an iron curtain that's extended across the world. And on one side are the communist nations, and the other side is the free world. And that was really the first time somebody identified what was going on. And then about maybe a year later, I'll give you a little bit of background on this. At the end of World War II, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill divided up Western Europe, and they decided that the eastern part would be all Russia, and the western part would be a combination of France, Britain, and the United States. So we had Western Germany, which was France, United States, and Germany, and UK, and then the eastern part was all Russia. And then within the center of the Russian was the city of Berlin, which was a city of 1 million people. To feed those people, they had to go through the Russian sector, and just without any notice in 1948, Stalin closed the canals, the highways, the rail lines and everything, and tried to starve the people out in Berlin. President Truman started something called the Berlin Blockade, and he started an Air Force flying propeller airplanes, C-54s, 24/7 to fly coal and wheat and laundry detergent, whatever it takes to keep 1 million people alive. And he did it for 1 year. And then a sign like this was entered. Eventually a wall was built, and that was really the formal beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War had two hot wars. It had Korea from 1950 to 53, and Vietnam, which kind of started under Eisenhower. And it went all the way up to Nixon. And if you look at this, whether we had a Republican or a Democratic president, they all were very anti-communist, and their all foreign policy was united. There wasn't any division at all. So if you had a liberal president or a conservative president, they were both united in terms of their fighting, in terms of keeping the free world free, and really defeating communism. Communism was defeated, and we'll go to the end already, with 4 people that should have got the Nobel Prize but never received it. One of them was a conservative politician, Margaret Thatcher, conservative politician from Britain. Another was a conservative president, Ronald Reagan. The third was a conservative pope, Pope John Paul, who had been a pope in Poland under the communists. And the fourth was a very liberal communist, Gorbachev. And he is still alive today. And those 4 people working together with a common goal of ending the Cold War without firing a shot. This is remarkable. Not a shot was fired. But suddenly, all these nations that the Soviet Union had incorporated as a defense, like Ukraine, like Hungary, like Poland, like Estonia, like Bulgaria, like Romania, were now set themselves free. And Putin was the KGB at that time. He saw all this, and he saw his country just disappear. And so that, I think, has laid the foundation for Putin's invasion into Ukraine today. So all these acts have a historical twist, and something happened 25 or 30 years ago that caused something to happen today. We have some very interesting aircraft developed for unique missions during the Cold War. The first one I'd like to talk about and made history is the U-2. This plane was almost a jet-powered glider. It flew at very, very high altitudes. They didn't have satellites then, so they took aerial photographs of various things. And there was a famous pilot named Gary Francis Powers, who was shot down when he was flying over the Soviet Union taking photographs. And he was in prison for almost a year until he was finally released. But this aircraft was developed by a very famous airplane designer at Lockheed named Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y, Johnson. So he designed this plane, and it's unique, and we're still flying this plane as a spy plane today, and it's got to be 70 years old. That's how far ahead he was in his design. Later on, he designed this spy plane called the SR-71. And it went even faster. And you can see it was short winged. It wasn't a glider. It was like a rocket with a man in it. And it was used for spying, and it's used today as one of our spy planes. So these 2 planes developed by the same man, Kelly Johnson, are our spy planes. We use primarily satellites, but they still need aircraft to get in there in certain situations. Let me put this over here. This is a unique plane. For me, it has a personal story. The plane was originally called the Intruder, and it was a heavy attack plane flying off carriers. And then later they came out with a revision of it for radar jamming called the Prowler, and it's called the E-6 Prowler, and this is what this aircraft is. I have a friend that was in the Navy at the time, and he flew over Iraq and sent me this certificate saying this plane that he was piloting, Lieutenant J.G. Jeffrey Lambert, was flying this aircraft over Iraq, and he dedicated the flight to James Walsh, which I thought was very nice and a super thing. And he also gave me this flag. I have 3 unique models with different technologies and different design features. The first one I'll talk about is the Navy Neptune. It's very much in design similar to that B-36 I showed you with the propellers and the jet engines. This had 2 propellers, reciprocal engines, and then 2 jet engines. and it was used for submarine hunting. So all this is the material that they would use to find submarines underwater. So it'd fly low, it had bombs, and when depth charges, when they found a submarine, they would drop it. It's made by Lockheed, and it served, it's still serving in countries like Japan and Korea today. Even though it's probably 60 or 70 years old in design, it was really a classic. And speaking of classic, this is the British Harrier. I took a badge here, it says British Harrier, even though this has Marine Corps markings on it. This is a plane that would take off vertically, so it would be sitting on the ground and just go up in the air like this, and then fly forward. It could fly backward, it could fly sideways, just like a helicopter. And it was incorporated into actually the U.S. Marine Corps was the primary user of it. And we built the aircraft under license from, Boeing built it, but they took the license from the British. And it's being phased out now because we have our new fighter, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, that has the capability, a version of it, to go up and sideways now. But this was a very, very unique design and a very unique concept. And it fit the Marine Corps perfectly because they could get real close to the troops and then pop up and do their action. This is breakthrough technology if there ever was any. It's called the Nightingale. And this was a plane that was used against Saddam Hussein to go through radar. The way it was shaped, radar would just bounce off, and so the radar couldn't track the airplane's progress. And then this was incorporated in our latest bombers. In our newest bomber, the B-21, which is under design, will have this kind of design. So it was breakthrough design. It wasn't that reliable, and it had a short career in the Air Force, probably 10 years, 15 years. But it was remarkable in terms of design, not remarkable in terms of performance. I have a variety of control sticks here. These are from various aircraft, and you can see this is the F-16 fighter and how complicated it is. There's something for the trimming the aircraft, there's something for the radio, there's something for the guns. It was a handful, to say the least. Here's one that I got in South Africa, and it was for the South African fighter, and they made it brass. Here's one from a Soviet helicopter. You see how crude that was? Barely fits your hand, and they had the controls up here. Soviet was very crude in terms of their design compared to the U.S. And this is from the, I believe the I got it backwards. Yeah, the and this here is controlling the microphone. The F-15. And this one, I'm not sure where it's from, but it's another control. This is a Cold War parachute. It could be used by mostly pilots flying fighter aircraft. Part of it is open just to show you that when it opened and is deployed, this is the first thing that would come out. And then it would pull the rest of the stuff out. This is not a safety chute. It's just kind of a trigger to open up the parachute. The parachute has to be signed off by a rigger. So there's certain classifications of airmen in the U.S. Air Force that their whole job is to, every 30 days, take every parachute apart, make sure all the parts are working well, and he tested it, and then he signs off on it. If something happens, he's responsible for that person's death. So it's a very serious situation. And pilots, even to this day, depend on the parachute to save their life. Now, small aircraft like I fly, we don't have parachutes, but for military aircraft or aerobatic airplanes, the ones you see doing those stunt performance, they do have parachutes. Well, when your engine quits, you want action. And this is what you have to save you. I had the parachute, I showed you that. But now if you're over water, each pilot had a life raft like this. And it was a tank to fill it up. And this one has 2 tanks. It also had a package of dye, yellow dye that you would open and put in the water so the rescue aircraft could see you for a long distance. It had a first aid kit. And some of them had a little balloon and an antenna on it and a hand crank radio. So you let the balloon up, it would take the antenna up, and then you would have a hand-cracked emergency radio on it. And some of them would have like 2 days of food as well. So that's what you depended on to save your life if you went down the sea. These two aircraft are designed to act as, eye in the sky. This is called a Hawkeye. It's Navy, and this is a radar dome. And so it flies up, and then from the bottom of that dome down, it tracks aircraft and ships and part of the air battle coverage. This is British. It flies at a higher altitude and a different kind of airplane, but it's the same function. It's for the British. This is for the U.S. Navy. During the Cold War, China played quite a large role. They were the instigators of the war in Korea. They were involved in Vietnam and the Soviet Union as well. So China played a forward role in some battles and a backward role in other battles. But the leader of all of China was Mao. Very complex guy. He was a former school teacher. He and his wife were a team, and they worked with the peasants. And their enemy was a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, who was a friend of America. His wife graduated from Wellesley College in New England. She spoke perfect English, and the Americans loved her and him. And so the conflict began during World War II, and China was busy fighting the Japanese on one hand and fighting the communists on another hand. And when the war ended, President Harry Truman sent his Secretary of State, George Marshall, to meet with Mao in the jungles. And he spent a small group of soldiers that had this special hat. This is a unique part of my collection. They wore this hat to identify that they were peacekeepers from the United States and not to be shot. And they met with Mao, and Mao lived in the jungle, and Chiang Kai-shek lived in Beijing. They met with Chiang, and they couldn't get any kind of agreement. And then it's probably 1948, about the time the Cold War started, Mao's troops defeated Chiang, and Chiang was forced to go to the island of Formosa, which is now Taiwan. And that's been a strategic battle going on ever since between China and Taiwan. We lived in Shanghai, and we also lived in Chengdu, China, and we also would go often to the island of Macau, which is off of Hong Kong, a Chinese island. Chinese are different people. They don't really respect their traditions, their older traditions. And you'll see an older village. On a weekend, bulldozers will come in and destroy it, and the next day there's an apartment going up there. So it's hard to get artifacts from China during this Cold War period. So this is Zhou Enlai. He was the Secretary of State under Mao. This is Mao. Mao watches. They had them readings. Mao was reading a little book like their Bible. And I picked up this in various kind of museums in China, but it's rapidly disappearing. But on the campuses, Shanghai University where I taught, and Southwestern University of Finance and Economics where I taught, there were still huge statues of Mao, but the students don't even pay attention to it. They have a different kind of communism, so they don't honor it. They walk by and ask them, "Who is that?" They say, "Mao." No big deal. It's like God didn't exist, but he was the father of their country. During the Cold War, we had air raid drills in our high schools and grade schools. Buildings were identified as fallout shelters, and they have these signs on them. And if you go in New York City, you can still see some apartments with a faded sign. There were individuals designated as civilian defense wardens. Some homes had Geiger counters and a book on how to use Geiger counters to identify radioactive waste in your house. You could also buy survival crackers. This is made by Nabisco. And they also didn't have bottled water then, but they had canned water. This is canned emergency drinking water for civil defense. So civil defense played a big role during that period, and many people in our lives today had never even heard of the term, but it was important to them, to the citizens during that period. Some people also told how to build bomb shelters. Some actually constructed bomb shelters in their backyard. So if there was an air raid, they would go into the shelter and close the door and hope the radiation never killed them. Okay, this is quite an interesting outfit, as you can see on the back of it. Pilots in Vietnam, after they had a mission, would put one of these on and go to the officers' club and drink. So this is a drinking suit. So each pilot had a different outfit with different symbols. This guy's, the name was Roy, and he would wear that when he goes drinking. So this is a drinking outfit for the pilots in Vietnam. Kind of a fad that took place. This is the Soviet Union, and because the aircrafts were very cold, this was heated, but also you can have thick material, and you can see that there were booties on there to keep the feet warm. This is for high altitude. It's not space, but it's for planes flying at a high altitude. And these are pressurized suits, so it would be hooked onto a pressurized system, and it would expand to keep blood flowing in the body. They also had a relief tube, a zipper, where they could urinate through there into a tube. So that was called a relief tube. These pilots all had relief tubes. Okay. This is the United States Navy, and they went through a period of having this kind of coloration, so if you were in the water, you would be easier to be spotted and have something gray. So this was the primary color for a while. We lived in Warsaw, Poland, and this is a Polish helicopter pilot. Notice the broad collar on it, and there's Polish writing here, and this is from Warsaw. When I was in Poland, I flew pretty much every week with an airline pilot. Their airline was called LOT, L-O-T. And he would take me, because he was a member of the Air Force Reserve, he would take me to the various Polish Air Force bases. So we would see the crews were actually wearing these, and we would be at a military base. I had to be escorted by him, but it was quite a privilege. This is a collection of a sample of some of the military stuff I acquired. Most of these items I acquired on the streets of really Moscow or St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time. And people were stealing this from the air bases and selling it for maybe $25 when it was worth probably $500. We'd also go to soccer fields, and they have a flea market in the soccer field up in the stand, so everybody would be selling military things where the seats were normally to watch a soccer match. And we had the same thing in Poland. So I would just buy, send back, and my wife said, "You're crazy with all this. What are you going to do with all this stuff?" Well, as it turned out, she had this house built as a museum for my collection. So she told me not to do it, but then she was an enabler and let me do it. These are two unique airplanes. This is the MiG-15. It was the primary jet fighter that Soviets had in Korea. It's very interesting to show you how naive politicians are. The Labor Department was in control of the government in England when the war ended, and they had the technology for the first jet airplane. The first jet airplane was actually British, not U.S. They went to the Soviets and they said, "We want to be your brothers, and we're going to give you all the technology so you can build your first jet fighter, courtesy of the loving British." And Stalin laughed in private. He said how stupid those people were. And this was the plane that they had. It was called the MiG-15, and the classic. This is a unique aircraft. I've never seen anything like it. Notice the shape of the wings are reversed from what they normally would be. The trailing edge of the wing is here, and the leading edge is back here. And it was just a modified, unsuccessful trial. This would be a typical hat used by infantry, not air. This helmet would be used by somebody flying this type of airplane, a MiG Su-29 or something. It's not a space at all. And this would actually go, their neck would go through here, underneath here, and they would be sealed. And that would keep it pressurized, and then they would use that flight suit. They went to a color scheme like we tried for safety, and later on in the 80s, if a pilot went down, they figured it would be easier to see if he or she had this kind of hat. And then the man that helped film this said, "This hat is so Russian, it really is." They went for these elaborate designs. Their aircraft were just crude, honestly. The fittings are very poor. They wouldn't have passed inspection in the United States, this plane included. But they were like tractors. You could do anything to them, they wouldn't fall apart. They were just made with strong arm tactics, and I think their clothing kind of reflects that as well. You could sleep in it, you could get shot at it, and it would still hold together. It wasn't fragile like American items were. This helmet and this sealer would be used by a pilot flying this airplane, not the MiGs, but this would be a more advanced aircraft. And even when you look at the cockpit here, the instruments look crude, the design is crude, and it translates into housing too. I mean, living in a communist country, all the apartments look crude, and they all look like they were designed by one guy. And they just built millions of them. They're durable, they're practical, they just weren't beautiful. Okay. This is an assortment of aircraft instruments used on the various Soviet aircraft. And this is an interesting picture because it's a picture of a cockpit of the Soviet bomber. And it looks very much like our B-29, which is the primary bomber we used to bomb the Japanese in World War II. The pilots would take off from Guam and they would fly to Japan. And if they had engine problems, they were told to ditch at sea and, if the last resort, to fly into the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was our ally, but once the plane landed, the American pilots were taken prisoner of war by their allies, the Soviets, and put in jail for the rest of the war. The Soviets then copied the airplane, and so this is the Soviet answer to our B-29. So their first bomber looked exactly like ours because when the plane landed, they took it apart, made one just like it, and that became their primary bomber. And it shows you, this is an ally. Can you imagine our troops landing in Britain and the British would put them in jail during World War II? So this is the instrumentation. They had a different view of safety. These are the goggles that they use, and these goggles were actually glass, not plastic, but glass. So if they cracked, the glass could get in the eye of the pilot, but they didn't be too concerned about that, so it was actually real glass. This is the hat of the our construction crews, or in Navy are called Seabees, and the Army is called Corps of Engineers. This is the equivalent for the Soviet Union. And then these are the various planes. I have a great collection of Soviet planes. And it's interesting how I got these because a man lived in Woodland Hills, which is just north of Los Angeles. His father lived in the Soviet Union, and his father would package these planes and send them to his son in Woodland Hills. I would buy them, and his son would send them to me in New Jersey, and they arrived in perfect shape. I have a great collection of Soviet aircraft. I probably have 100 of these different models. And this one I didn't get that way. This one I got from a U.S. manufacturer, but this is one of the primary planes, the MiGs, MiG-29. I have Life magazine here with a picture of the first astronaut to go into outer space with the Prime Minister Khrushchev. And this is probably 1960. And the Soviets always, their colors are red. So you can notice in all their flags, and their symbol is the hammer and the sickle. And that was throughout their entire history. So you can see that. You can see it behind here. This is their primary automatic weapon was AK-47. It was just about the best automatic weapon ever designed. And this is a clip to hold the ammunition for that gun. And it's killed more people probably than the atomic bomb has ever killed, the AK-47. These are not pilot helmets. These are helmets worn by the crew that operate on the aircraft carrier to protect. And each color signifies a different thing. Green, red, blue, orange. This would be the jacket that they would wear. And these helmets, some people would be in charge of releasing. This is our current fighter in the U.S. Navy, the F-A-18 Hornet. So if you see an aircraft carrier, this is the plane that would be launched today. It's made by Boeing, and it's our primary plane. And a little bit of an embarrassment. When this plane is launched, it can only fly a half hour. It has to be refueled by a tanker. So after they launch these planes, you see them take off and say, oh my God, they're going to attack. No way. They got to circle and refuel because they can't take off with a full load of fuel. American technology, right? This was a great airplane. It's the F-4 Phantom. It's made by McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis. Then McDonnell Douglas went out of business and Boeing took over. And it was a great airplane, very practical. This plane I always liked, and so I have 3 different models of it. It's a transport plane, and it had a clamshell opening in the back where they could load troops and things on. It was made by Fairchild. It's called the F-119, Flying Boxcar. It was used in Vietnam. It was used in Korea. It was used all post-war because it carried a good load, and before jet engines, it was very practical. This is the A6 Intruder. It was a variation to the Jammer that I showed you earlier that my friend flew over Iraq. This was the biggest bomber to take off from an aircraft carrier. It carried a huge load. It was made by Grumman. This was a probe for refueling. It looked ugly, but it was a great, very successful airplane, very reliable, and did the job. The Air Force was concerned that all these helmets didn't look very fashionable. So for flying pilots of B-52, they constructed helmets that looked like a baseball cap with a bill on it, and that would protect them. But it didn't work out, and it was abandoned. All pilots in fighter airplanes especially, and I have one myself when I fly, have a clip like this that fits on our knee, and then we write down the instructions that the aircraft center gives us or the tower gives us. And so I have a collection of these. Over here is quite a story. It's quite a story. It's a story about General Douglas MacArthur, who was a giant in American military history. He really won World War II. He helped rebuild Japan to what it is today. He was called the American Caesar. He was outstanding in every way. He had a huge ego, and he was the smartest guy ever to graduate from West Point. His boss was the only president we ever had that only went to high school. Harry Truman only went to high school. He never went to college. And he had a funny accent, and this guy wanted to attack China during the Korean War, drop atomic bombs on them, which would have been suicidal. This guy told him not to do it, but he never listened to this guy. And so President Harry Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur. I remember when it happened because it was the biggest ticker tape parade ever held in the history of New York City. Everybody said Truman made the wrong decision, and MacArthur shouldn't have been fired. Until about 2 years later when everybody did a 180 and said, Truman made a wonderful decision. And President Truman probably made the greatest decisions of any president we've ever had. He never made a bad one. He thought about it. He was a very humble guy, and he made the right decisions, and he stuck to it. You could just do an entire course in business school on leadership and use President Harry Truman as your model, and you would never go wrong because he did the tough ones. He was a liberal president, but he took on the labor unions, and when they went on strike, he fired the labor unions and put the army in charge of running the railroads. He was a very practical guy. He integrated the military. He built the United Nations. He reconstructed Europe under the Marshall Plan. He established recognition of Israel. He did all the tough things that nobody wanted to do, and he stepped up. He had a sign on his desk that says, "The buck stops here." That's a great lesson for all of us. The buck stops here. He never blamed anybody else. And he had another sign on his desk that says, "If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen." And I think that's a lesson for all of us in terms of leadership and management roles. If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. It's your call, and you got to take the heat. And he took it, and he made wonderful calls and wonderful decisions. When my wife built this house and designed it, she designed it with the concept of having a museum for my military, World War II and World War I. The shells were all put in for the Cold War here, and then she decided to take one of our garages and turn it into a stable so that I could display our equestrian stuff. And the pride of this collection is this actual Amish sleigh that I bought in the Amish country. I've had it about 50 years. It's about 150 years old. It's actually a practical sleigh because when I lived in New Jersey, I had a horse named Monty Walsh, and Monty would pull this. And this is all the equipment used, the harnesses and everything, including bells. And we would go through the neighborhood before the plow came through to take kids on a ride, and it was quite a thing. They did a story in our local newspaper about the sleigh and Monty Walsh. And these are our saddles. Pardon me. And we're still active riders. We try to ride probably 3 times a month. And but we don't own horses now. We just rent them. But we're still very active in the horses.